Hey, RetconRaider here. Today I thought we'd dive back into the Van Buren design documents, picking up with Design Document 2, which covers the ruins of post-apocalyptic Denver. Where the first design document was short and mostly off-topic, the Denver design document is actually pretty thorough. In fact, there's so much information in there that I couldn't reasonably fit it all into one video. So today we'll just be focusing on an overview of the area as a whole. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started, shall we? Prior to the war, Denver was a hotbed of industrial activity, with profits being channeled into the nearby research facilities in Boulder. Unfortunately, a toxic chemical leak from the nearby Rocky Mountain arsenal killed numerous people. Although tragic, this disaster prompted the United States government to approve funding of a self-contained research facility near Boulder, which ironically triggered a building boom in Denver, drawing construction workers and aspiring scientists from all over the country. The population in Denver rapidly spiked as people flooded into the city to help support the new military contracts. But this ground to a sudden halt when the resource wars began in the 2050s, as the United States shifted its focus from construction to defense. Suddenly flooded with the unemployed, tensions in Denver quickly rose until the disenfranchised workers began a series of protests and riots over what they saw as inaction by the federal government. Things became even worse as the region began suffering from severe food shortages later in the war, hitting the city particularly hard due to its high population density. Work riots soon became food riots, the city was set ablaze, and before long the National Guard was called in to help the local police force suppress the riots. They established a makeshift prison using Instapens, portable prison cells used to contain the rioters they detained. Unfortunately, this aggressive peacekeeping tactic quickly backfired as normal citizens began attacking the troops as well in hopes that they would be arrested, so they could enjoy the relative safety and guaranteed meals that imprisonment offered. Then disaster struck as Chinese spies attempted to steal samples of the new plague from a nearby military research facility. Although the spies were killed before they got too far, they inadvertently unleashed the disease on the city, and it rapidly spread through the densely packed populace. Instapens were quickly repurposed for use in quarantine zones, but the National Guard were unable to prevent people from fleeing the city en masse, further spreading the disease and gridlocking the surrounding highways with abandoned vehicles. The government quickly funded research projects in hopes of finding a treatment for the disease, eventually leading to the development of the force evolutionary virus. But by then it was too late. The resource wars had ended, but the Great War began, ending after just one day with the nuclear bombardment that effectively brought an end to the modern world. In the years after the apocalypse, Denver remained largely abandoned, in part due to seasonal radioactive dust storms and massive packs of feral dogs, descended from the numerous attack dogs and guard dogs used by the Denver Police Department and the National Guard. Small numbers of scavengers and slavers visited the city from time to time, and the ruins quickly earned the nickname Dogtown, due to the dangers posed by the aggressive packs of wild dogs that roamed the streets. No concerted effort was made to loot the city until the arrival of the NCR in 2251. This group was predominantly made up of work-release prisoners and their assigned guards, and they were under orders to strip the city of anything salvageable to help support the rebuilding of nearby facilities such as Fort Aradesh and Hoover Dam. Unfortunately, things rapidly fell apart after their arrival. Fort Aradesh was overwhelmed by Caesar's legion and subsequently abandoned, effectively leading to the NCR's withdrawal from the region, which in turn left the salvaging team stranded in hostile territory. The guards assigned to watch the prisoners grew bored and frustrated with their work, abandoning their posts and leaving for the nearby settlements in Boulder and Hoover Dam. With nowhere else to go, the salvagers remained in Denver, continuing to voluntarily serve out their sentences in hopes of someday being able to return to NCR territory to resume their normal lives. As if things weren't already bad enough, their camp was subsequently overwhelmed by a massive dog attack, forcing them to relocate to a new makeshift camp established in the relative safety offered by some of the crumbling skyscrapers. Since then, the salvagers have remained active in the city, continuing to loot the surrounding territories in hopes of finding enough salvage to eventually buy out their prison sentences. By the time the player arrives in 2253, the scavengers are still hard at work stripping the city of its resources, but they're still struggling against numerous threats, including a rival team of scavengers, a small camp of Legion slavers, the roaming packs of wild dogs, feral glowing ghouls, supply shortages, and a slowly brewing internal power struggle. From a game design standpoint, Denver was considered a semi-critical location for the player to visit. Although much of the content was optional, the storyline called for the player to arrive in Denver, meet with the NCR salvagers, explore the region to discover more about the plague outbreak, dealing with the dogs and getting some loot in the process, all of which would ultimately point the player towards Boulder Dome, where they would be able to continue the main storyline. Denver was intended to be one of the largest explorable locations in the game, essentially offering a smaller secondary world map that encompassed a chunk of the city roughly 7 square miles in size. This map would have had 11 prominent locations for the player to visit, with some, such as the new Salvager camp, being vital to the main storyline, while others, such as Lowry Hospital and Boardwalk Brewing, were purely optional locations that were involved in minor side quests, or served as potential loot caches for the player to discover. The region would have also had its own unique random encounter charts, with most of the enemies being relatively weak, making it a fairly ideal destination for low-level players near the start of the game. The primary threat would be posed by roving packs of wild dogs, occasionally accompanied by pre-war cyber dogs left over from the Denver PD or National Guard. There would be a large but finite number of dogs in Denver, and a particularly thorough or aggressive player could eventually wear down their numbers to the point where they would no longer be encountered. Other common threats would include giant mutant lizards during the day, as well as giant roaches and rats at night. Killing several packs of mutant lizards would temporarily reduce the chance of encountering more, but the giant roaches and rats would serve as an effectively infinite source of potential low-level encounters. Wandering near the edge of the city would occasionally trigger random encounters with rad scorpions as well, but only smaller and weaker ones. Another notable but relatively rare threat would be posed by the glowing ghouls who wandered into Denver from the reservation. They would be a potentially deadly threat to low-level players, but they were also unique. They would only be encountered while exploring near the north side of town, and only until the player found a way to kill them or otherwise drive them off. A more insidious threat would be posed by the 3 Cerberus robots, unique riot suppression robots once used by the Denver Police Department prior to the Great War. These robots remained inactive but well-maintained for over a century after the bombs fell, but once the player arrives in Denver, Odysseus would reactivate them remotely in hopes of using them to round up the player or any other escaped prisoners in the area, so that Argos could then return them to the Tibbetts facility. These 3 robots were unique, and if any of them were destroyed, then they would provide an ample source of salvageable materials as a reward and would not respawn. If they were merely damaged, they would retreat to the ruins of the Denver Police Department so they could be repaired by their automated maintenance bays. Particularly resourceful players would be able to track them back to the police department and potentially reprogram them to help with managing the other threats found around the city, such as the roving packs of dogs. Depending on the player's story decisions in Denver, things could end up becoming drastically worse, potentially triggering an outbreak of heavily armed and armored robots, which would significantly increase the difficulty of random encounters. But I'll get into that quest line in the next video. Simply wandering around Denver could prove to be a good source of general salvage and common resources, and the 11 main areas of the Denver map were going to be supplemented with numerous random maps with their own enemies and loot caches to discover. This would make exploration a potentially profitable activity, but would also be somewhat risky. Not only because of the enemies that might be encountered, but also because the NCR salvagers have set up a complex series of property claims, much in the same way that miners set up mining claims. If the player was caught claim jumping, then it would hurt their reputation with the Salvager faction, possibly closing off some of the quests. Now, before we wrap up this video, let's take a brief look at the 11 main locations planned for the Denver area. I'll go into these locations in heavier detail next time, but this should give you a good overall idea of what was planned. First, we have the Old Camp. As the name implies, this is where the NCR salvagers first set up camp, before they were driven to higher ground by packs of hungry dogs. The Old Camp is at ground level beneath 3 parallel overpasses and fortified with salvaged chain-link fencing, insta-pens, stacks of tires, and ruined vehicles, which they moved using a crane they managed to repair. This area was primarily intended to serve a minor narrative purpose as well as a potential source for some valuable loot. When the salvagers were forced to flee, they abandoned a number of their supplies here, which the player could either retrieve for them or claim for themselves. The developers also planned to link this area to an explorable series of sewer tunnels that would connect to other areas, but that part of the design document was never finished. The second main location was the New Camp, a multi-story building surrounded by fencing and stacks of burning tires, which served to ward off the roving packs of dogs. This is where the salvagers are currently holed up, when they're not out working their claims. Like the old camp, this area was also intended to be connected to the sewer lines, allowing faster travel between different sublocations on the Denver map. This would have served as the main settlement hub of the region, where the player would do the vast majority of their trading and find various Denver-specific side quests. There were numerous NPCs planned for this location, but we'll take a closer look at them next time. The third main location was the police headquarters, which would serve as a fairly important location for players trying to find out more about the new plague that once ravaged the city. Other optional goals in this area would include disabling or reprogramming the 3 Cerberus units, finding Job, one of the game's potential companions, finding clues pointing toward the police chief's private bomb shelter, and dealing with Dogbody, a former NCR salvager who went mad and caused the massive attack on the old camp. Interestingly, the design document also indicates that the Denver Mint and City Hall were originally intended to be included as part of this location, but both of those maps were scribbled out, indicating that they were going to be cut from the final game. Then there's the Box, another location I'll spend a little bit more time talking about in the next video. But for now, suffice to say it's a pre-war robot manufacturing plant that the salvagers currently have an unhealthy fixation on. It's also a location that Odysseus has a rather keen interest in, and depending on how the player ends up handling some of the related quests, it can end up making Denver a much safer, or much more dangerous, place. Beyond that, the remaining locations posed varying obstacles for the player to overcome and varying loot caches for the player to discover. The rival salvager camp, for example, was a straightforward combat area. The rival salvagers would always be hostile to the player, meaning that they would need to be killed, avoided, or snuck past if the player wanted to explore their little corner of the map. Bombay Jack's Canyon served a similar purpose, literally acting as a gauntlet that the player would have to navigate in order to reach the box. Much like Dogbody, Bombay Jack was another crazy local salvager who the player would ultimately end up having to deal with if they wanted to pass through this area unscathed. Players who had managed to access and explore the sewer lines would have a much easier time navigating the canyon, because they would be able to bypass several of Bombay Jack's explosive traps. The Small Caesars Legion camp would be slightly more welcoming, provided the players didn't have any issue with slavers. This location would allow the player to learn a bit about the Legion, a threat that was originally planned to return in Fallout 4. Then there was Union Station, a purely optional location tied into the Trade Routes questline. This location would be vital if the player wanted to establish reliable trade routes between the game's major settlements. The remaining locations were mainly intended to serve as interesting loot locations. Boardwalk Brewing was a potential source of salvage and trade goods, with particularly resourceful players being able to salvage brewing equipment, which would allow the NCR salvagers to begin manufacturing and trading beer with other settlements. Lowry Hospital was intended to provide a potential source of more information on the new plague, as well as a hefty stash of various medical goods, which could be kept or traded with the local salvagers. And the police chief's Fallout shelter, assuming the player could actually find it, served as a particularly valuable loot cache. Only the most resourceful or lucky of players were supposed to find this location, and they would be rewarded with an assortment of supplies, light armor, and weapons, including some unspecified items related to the roving dog packs. That covers all of the prominent locations planned for the Denver area, and hopefully gives you a good overview of what the designers had in mind for this part of the game. Next time, we'll take a closer look at the characters and quest lines that the area would have had to offer. But for now, this is RetconRaider, signing off. Thanks for listening. Oh, and remember, although I do love talking about Fallout Van Buren, you can check out all 700 pages worth of design documents for yourself by visiting the Fallout Wikis. Links are in the description.